Anxiety is a strange beast. As a psychiatrist, I've learned that anxiety and its close cousin panic are both born from fear. As a behavioral neuroscientist, I know that fear's main evolutionary function is helping us survive. In fact, fear is the oldest survival mechanism we've got. Fear helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations in the future through a process called negative reinforcement. For example, if we step out into a busy street, we turn our head and we see a car coming right at us, we instinctively jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk. Evolution made this really simple for us. So simple that we only need 3 elements in situations like this to learn: an environmental cue, a behavior, and a result. In this case, walking up to a busy street cues us to look both ways before crossing. The result of not getting killed helps us remember to repeat that action again in the future. Now, sometime in the last million years, humans evolved a new layer on top of our more primitive survival brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex. Involved in creativity and planning, the prefrontal cortex helps us think and plan for the future. It predicts what will happen in the future based on past experience. If information is lacking, our prefrontal cortex lays out different scenarios about what might happen and guesses which will be the most likely scenario to happen. It does this by running simulations based on previous events that are most similar. Enter anxiety. Defined as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome, anxiety comes up when our prefrontal cortices don't have enough information to accurately predict the future. We all saw how this happened with the novel coronavirus that was discovered at the end of 2019. Scientists raced to study the characteristics of any new virus so that we know precisely how contagious and deadly it is, and so we can act accordingly. Uncertainty abounds. Without accurate information, it is easy for our brains to spin stories of fear and dread. In addition to being fueled by uncertainty, anxiety is also contagious. In psychology, the spread of emotion from one person to another is aptly termed social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who is anxious. Their fear for words are like a sneeze landing directly on our brain, emotionally infecting our prefrontal cortex and sending it out of control as it worries about everything from whether our family members will get sick to how our jobs will be affected, for example, with the COVID pandemic. Wall Street's a great example of social contagion. We watched the stock market spike and crash, the stock indices being a thermometer for how feverish our collective anxiety is at any one moment. Wall Street even has something known as the fear index, which with the coronavirus outstripped the financial meltdown of 2008. Now, when we can't control our anxiety, that emotional fever spikes into panic. One definition of panic is sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Overwhelmed by uncertainty and fear of the future, the rational thinking parts of our brains go offline. For example, with a pandemic, logically, we know that we don't need a 6-month supply of toilet paper or whatever. But when we see someone else's cart piled higher at the grocery store, their anxiety infects us and we go into survival mode. So how do we not panic? Too many times I've seen my anxious clinic patients try to suppress or think themselves out of their anxiety. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on the prefrontal cortex, which isn't available at these critical moments. Instead, I start by teaching them how their brain works so that they can see how uncertainty weakens the brain's ability to deal with stress, priming it for anxiety when fear hits. I'll give you an example of a patient that I saw in my clinic. He was referred to me for anxiety. And when I started taking his history, he was describing how when he would drive on the highway, he would start to get panic attacks. And those panic attacks led him to avoid driving on the highway. He was also very overweight. And so what can I do as a psychiatrist? Well, maybe I should start with my own anxiety. So when I try to treat patients with medications, there's this number in medicine called number needed to treat, which gives us a sense for how well a treatment's going to work. For the best medications out there for anxiety, the number needed to treat is 5.2, which means for every 5 patients I treat, only one of them shows a significant reduction in anxiety symptoms. So how do I know which of these patients to treat? I'm basically playing the medication lottery. I don't know which ones are going to benefit, and I don't know how to help the other ones. Well, all too long, we've relied on willpower, just trying to think our way out of anxiety or trying to force ourselves not to get anxious. Yet that doesn't work so well either. As I love this quote that's attributed to Albert Einstein, in which he says, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. That's what this is all about. Our weak and young prefrontal cortex can't be relied on in times of anxiety. That's exactly when the prefrontal cortex goes offline. So here, I started to take a different approach. My lab had been studying habit change for a long time. We'd been looking at how to help people quit smoking and how to help people stop overeating and stop eating due to stress and boredom. And we'd gotten some pretty good results in a study that we did with helping people quit smoking. We actually got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment in helping people quit smoking. We also got a 40% reduction in people eating when cued by craving in a study led by Ashley Mason at UCSF, a 40% reduction. And that was with an app. So we had been learning some things about how to help people change habits. And what had we been using? We'd been using something very simple, not necessarily easy, but simple, which is awareness. And what I'm going to do is talk about a 3-step process that we've been seeing where we can help people change habits, whether it's smoking or overeating or even worrying. And this 3-step process is something that anybody can employ in their own lives. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you need a trigger, a behavior, and a reward to form a habit. So how does anxiety actually get formed as a habit? Well, it turns out there's a fair amount of research from the 1980s. Thomas Borkovic and others suggested that worry gets reinforced in the same way as any other negatively reinforced behavior. That unpleasant feeling of anxiety or fear triggers the mental behavior of worrying. So behaviors aren't just about physically doing something like smoking or eating, but they can also be mental. Worrying counts as a mental behavior. And what's the reward of that? Well, the feeling of being in control, even if we're not really in control, or that feeling of at least we're doing something when we're worrying, is more rewarding than not doing something when we're anxious. Now, this anxiety can then trigger worry. Worry can then feed back and trigger more anxiety. So we can start to spiral out of control when we're anxious. So how can we work with this? Here's a 3-step process that's based on awareness and based on mindfulness training that my lab has been studying. I'm just going to mention for a minute or so some of the research that we've done so you can see that this isn't just some 3-step process that I made up, but a process that's based on the neuroscience of how our brain works and also the clinical science of what my lab has been studying, all the clinical trials that my lab has done over the last several decades. So first I'll say, that number needed to treat in medicine, when I give a medicine to a patient with anxiety, it's 1 in 5 are going to benefit from that. So what we did was we said, okay, can we take these neuroscience principles and can we start to train people to map out their own habit loops around anxiety? Can we help them bring awareness and curiosity in as a way to help them step out of these habit loops? And if we do that, how well does this help people overcome their anxiety? So the way that we tested this was by developing an app called Unwinding Anxiety. And we started with anxious physicians because I can speak personally. Physicians tend to be hard to work with. We've learned in medical school to armor up, to not, to compartmentalize our own needs and feelings, and to prioritize helping our patients over ourselves. Well, unfortunately, this has led to a huge epidemic of burnout in healthcare professionals, not just physicians, but many healthcare professionals. So we said, well, can we help anxious physicians? We did a study with anxious physicians, and we gave them this Unwinding Anxiety app and looked over the course of 3 months to see how much their anxiety reduced. And what we found was somewhat remarkable. We found a 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scales within 3 months of people using the program. Even more remarkable than that was we threw in some burnout questionnaires, because what we found was at baseline in this study that there was a strong correlation between anxiety and certain elements of burnout. And lo and behold, we also found that certain elements of burnout reduced by up to 50% in this study, because those two are tightly correlated, without us even needing to mention the word burnout in this Unwinding Anxiety app. Now, this was a study, of about 40 physicians. It didn't have a control group, so we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a fluke. 57% reduction in anxiety is pretty significant. So we got some funding from the NIH, and we did a randomized controlled trial of people with generalized anxiety disorder. And we gave some of them, half the group was randomized to get usual clinical care so they could see their clinicians, get medications, whatever. And then the other half got that plus this Unwinding Anxiety app. You ready for this? After 2 months, we found a 67% reduction in anxiety, 67% reduction. And we also found that number needed to treat, remember with medications is 5.2. In this study, that number needed to treat was 1.6. So that was really remarkable in terms of, as a neuroscientist, it's nice to see these neuroscientific principles lining up. And as a clinician, it was nice to see that we could develop something that's accessible, that folks can download to their phone, that can really help them reduce their anxiety significantly. Now, the hallmark of science is reproducibility. We had done 2 studies that were pretty positive. We also wanted to see if this Unwinding Anxiety app could help people with worry that was affecting their sleep. As a psychiatrist, I see a lot of my patients who come in and they have sleep problems. And I ask them this question. I say, when your head hits the pillow, what does your brain do? And their brain starts spinning like, oh, they regret things that they've done in the past. They beat themselves up over it, or they worry about what's going to come next. And then as they get revved up, because that's very anxiety provoking, they look over at the clock and they see that they're not getting to sleep, and they start worrying about how they're not getting enough sleep. So long story short, we did another study, another randomized controlled trial, and found, again, we could get significant reductions in anxiety. This was in individuals where anxiety was affecting their sleep. And we could also get significant reductions in sleep problems, in these NIH indices of worry that was affecting sleep. We get a 33% reduction in anxiety that was interfering with sleep. And this was, again, within 2 months. So all of that together suggests that, in fact, when we target these behavioral mechanisms, we might actually be able to see significant clinical results. Now, I won't go too much into the neuroscience, but I'll just say that we've studied how the brain changes when patients and when individuals participating in our research studies meditate. And we've found that with experienced meditators, networks of brain regions like the default mode network, which gets activated, the more we worry, the more this network gets activated. And the default mode network is involved in self-referential processing. So when we're worrying about things that are relating to us in the future, the more we worry, the more this default mode network gets activated. What we found about 10 years ago was that in experienced meditators, that same network of brain regions quiets down when somebody is meditating. And we found that curiosity, when somebody's being curious about their experience, the same thing happens. Just to summarize, about 10 years of research, what we found, not only do these brain regions get deactivated, but they can even correlate with clinical outcomes. In a study where with people that were trying to quit smoking, we found that when we used our app-based mindfulness training for smoking, we could target this default mode network, and that the more this default mode network got quiet, the more it predicted reductions in cigarette smoking. So that was really encouraging to see that we can line up these behavioral mechanisms, this reinforcement learning process that I've been talking about, and also these brain mechanisms. So let's go through these 3 steps of changing, working with anxiety, working with worry. And I'll also say working with self-judgment, because this is a big area that I see where it gets in the way of people's happiness and their well-being, is when they're judging themselves. The trigger, remember that trigger behavior result process, the trigger is that they might have some thought about something that happened to them or something that they did. Their behavior is to judge themselves. And then the result is, even though they can't change the past, at least they can feel like they're doing something. So with these 3 steps of habit change, the first step is to be able to map out the process itself. If we can't see how our brain's working, we can't possibly work with them. I'll give you an example. I'll read an example of somebody who had used our Unwinding Anxiety app, who was mapping this process out for themselves. Person wrote, "For me, when I get anxious, I tend to spiral in negative thoughts, mostly about myself. The self-loathing and doubt get terrible. And for some reason, the only thing that makes it feel better is basically confessing to someone I respect or love in order to have them assure me that I'm not bad. I am a good person. So my thought pattern is this: trigger, well, there are a million. Behavior, feel guilty about some way in which I'm a bad person, and then turn to someone else to reassure me that I am a good person. The result? This only reinforces my brain's habit that I'm only a good person if someone else says so, thereby perpetuating my inability to get that reassurance from within." I think I've been aware of how anxiety makes me beat myself up for some time, but never made that connection about how that behavior of needing to confess to someone just perpetuates the cycle. So there's a great example of somebody mapping out that trigger behavior result process. How about my patient who was referred to me for anxiety, who had, was getting panic attacks while driving on the highway? In fact, this patient had full-blown panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. So what I did was I sent him home, and I gave him our Unwinding Anxiety app, and I said, "Hey, just map out this process and let me know what you discover." I set up a follow-up for him 2 weeks later. He came back, and the first thing he said to me was, "Hey, doc, I lost 14 pounds. Remember, he was at a very unhealthy weight." And I said, "Well, what's going on there?" Because we hadn't even talked about weight loss yet. And he said, "Well, I was mapping out these anxiety habit loops." And he said, my habit was this: the trigger was the anxiety, the behavior was to eat. And then the result, well, I realized that it wasn't actually helping my anxiety. So I stopped doing that. He went on to lose over 150 pounds because he could map out this process and see that it wasn't serving him. So this is a really critical piece, and this speaks to the next step of the process. So once we've mapped out our habit loops, the second step is based on some neuroscience, which is that behavior is only going to get learned if it's rewarding, and we're only going to be able to change that behavior if it is unrewarding. So long story short, if we bring awareness in as we're doing a habit, so for example, worrying, my patient with his stress eating, he started paying attention to his stress eating, and he realized, oh, that stress eating isn't really rewarding. So he became disenchanted with it. And that started to change that reward value in his brain. So it was easier for him to step out of that habit loop. Notice how that wasn't about willpower. It was simply about awareness. The same is true for worrying. When we start to worry, we can notice, is this worrying solving the problem? Is it keeping my family member safe? Is it helping me, make sure that the future is certain? And when we see, no, it doesn't actually do any of those things, it only makes me more anxious, then we start to become disenchanted with that behavior itself. My lab has done studies with this. I won't go into the details, but we find that it only takes 10 to 15 times of somebody, like if somebody's struggling with overeating, for them to really pay attention as they overeat, for that reward value to drop below 0. The same can be true for worrying. If we worry and we see that it's not helping us, we become disenchanted with it. If we beat ourselves up, if we judge ourselves and we see that that's not actually helping us change something that happened in the past and is only making us feel bad about ourselves, we can start to become disenchanted with that behavior as well. I think of step 3 as finding that bigger, better offer. When our brains are disenchanted because they've really seen how unrewarding worrying is or beating ourselves up is, that opens up the space for our brains to find something better. And here, I like this quote from Einstein. He says, "I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious." Here we can start to notice, okay, if worry doesn't feel that good for me, how does that feel compared to being curious about the feelings of anxiety in my body? When I beat myself up, or when I judge myself, how does that feel? And how does that compare to being kind to myself? So bigger, better offers are about finding intrinsically rewarding mental behaviors like kindness and curiosity as a way not to only step out of our old habit loops, but to step into a habit loop that's not only more rewarding, so we'll naturally continue to do it, but one that is helpful for us, one that doesn't just perpetuate an unhealthy habit loop. I'll read to you a quote from somebody who was having panic attacks. This person wrote, "When I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic, and instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting, I actually felt it. I was so thrilled." I'll read you one other example. This person said, "This has been truly life-altering. When I had a full-blown panic attack, looking inside made it just melt away. I was looking at what I was feeling instead of obsessing over why I was feeling it." So this is really the key. Step 1, map out a habit loop. Step 2, see what that behavior is and how rewarding it is. If we're worrying, how rewarding is that? If we're judging ourselves, how rewarding is that? And step 3, when we're worrying, can we be curious about what that feels like in our bodies instead? Does that help us be with that experience rather than feel like we have to do something about it? When we're judging ourselves, can we bring some kindness into ourselves? And what does that feel like as compared to beating ourselves up? So just to bring this to a close, how did my patient do? As I mentioned, he lost a bunch of weight by bringing this 3-step process in for himself when he was stress eating. How about his anxiety? Well, I teach at the School of Public Health at Brown University, which is in downtown Providence, Rhode Island. One time I was walking out of class onto Main Street where the School of Public Health is located, and this car pulls up. And this person rolls down his window, and it's my patient. And I looked at him and I was like, great, he's driving. And no kidding, he says to me, "Oh, hey, Dr. Judd, I'm an Uber driver now. I'm headed to the airport to pick someone up." So I just thought that was a really nice bookend where curiosity really can be our superpower to help us overcome all sorts of unhealthy habits, from stress eating to worrying to judging ourselves. I'll just end with a quote from a wonderful poem from Rumi, who said, "Be empty of worrying. Think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Move outside the tangle of fear thinking. Live in silence. Flow down and down in always widening rings of being." And so just remember this: curiosity helps us open to, helps us turn toward, helps us widen and be connected with our world rather than turning away from it. Kindness helps us open to ourselves instead of beating ourselves up. And both of these can be superpowers to help us not only overcome sometimes long-standing habit loops of worry, of anxiety, of whatever, but also can help us start to form new habits of kindness, of connection, and of curiosity that can help us all move forward in this world, this ever-changing world. And we can all move forward together. Thank you very much.